Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be going over The One Thing, Chapter 9, Big is Bad, the final chapter of this section of the book, Part 1 of the book, titled The Lies. And we were talking about the lies that they tell you about success and how to be successful. And Gary outlines a few things that we've talked about. Balance, we talked about last week. Discipline, we talked about the week before that one. And today, big is bad. And I'm just going to go to the first slide. We're going to just jump right into it. Big is not always bad. Big is bad is a lie, according to Gary Keller. And he writes in the book, if you fear big success, you'll either avoid it or sabotage your efforts to achieve it. The way that I think about this is the adage, if you shoot for the moon, at least you'll have the stars. I think that's from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. And I've always said, if you shoot for like a huge goal, and you don't make it, all the other goals that were below that threshold now have become within your firing range. So if you didn't set that big goal, then none of those other ones might have been possible, because when you set that big goal, you're not really thinking about going past it. You're thinking about going to it. So now everything else below it becomes achievable. If you guys know what I'm saying, if I'm explaining that correctly, hopefully that the message of that is coming through. It's essentially you set the big goal to make everything underneath it possible, and you're still going for the big goal, but if you don't, and the goal would have been smaller, well, you might not have hit those other goals below your original threshold. So you make a goal, you want to score, let's put an example to this, a sports example. You set out a goal, you want to score 50 points in a game. Versus if you set a goal to say, hey, I want to score 20 points in a game. Well, you don't score 50 points in a game, but you score 45. Versus the other, if your goal's just 20, maybe you come to 20 and you hit it. And then you say, oh, I hit my goal. But before, you didn't hit your goal, but you scored more points. You guys see what I'm saying there? So that's kind of how I interpret this, like big is not always bad. Like it seems daunting to think big. It seems very daunting, and it comes with a lot of responsibility. There's repercussions to thinking big, consequences. You might get out of balance by thinking big, but it's not bad because it leads you down the path to your one thing by having this big thinking. So who's afraid of the big, bad, big? Well, say that 10 times fast. But people often think big means something's hard, complicated, it's time consuming, it's daunting. It's going to bring about crushing effort. It's going to stress you out if you think big, if you try to have big goals. So what do people do is they lower their goals. Hey, I'm just going to do the absolute minimum necessary because it's safe and I'm not going to be stressed out and I'm going to be able to do other things and be in balance like we were talking about last week, etc. But Gary says that that's wrong. You shouldn't think like that. You shouldn't think like that. And he has this quote in the book there, that first bullet point. How many ships didn't sail because of the belief that the earth was flat? Right? All these people in the early, what was that, 1400s, 1500s, sailed across the world. People told them, no, don't do it. Don't do it. You're going to fall off the face of the earth. But they still did it, and they discovered new land. So this thinking that big is bad is really just a mentality of limiting yourself, of limiting yourself. And yes, we all have limits, but how do you know what your actual limits are? And are the limits that you set on yourself today really your limits? Or can you become something bigger than that? And the only way to get there is to, again, think big, extend that threshold. And then everything underneath that threshold now becomes possible. I remember listening to Grant Cardone, and he had a story about a homeless man out there, panhandling, begging for money, and he's just asking for $1. And he told the guy, why don't you ask for $100? And it's kind of the same thinking. Everything underneath the $100 now becomes possible, because most people aren't going to give a guy $100, but they'll give him 50 because, hey, that's half of it, right? But you would have never gotten that 50 if you were just asking for $1. Again, going back to that basketball points goal, the goal of scoring 50 points versus the goal of scoring 20 points. And then Gary outlines this story here, the Hotmail story. Let me see if I can find it. So there's this guy, Sabir Bhatia, arrives in America, only $250 in his pocket, ends up creating Hotmail, and Microsoft eventually buys Hotmail for $400 million. I remember Hotmail was the first email I ever had back in like middle school. Yeah, it's crazy. I don't even know if it's around anymore. It's got to still be around. But according to his mentor, Farouk Arjani, Sabir's success was directly related to his ability to think big. What set him apart? Gargantuan size of his dream. He was completely convinced he was going to build a major company. Unrelenting conviction. He knew he was going to pull it off. In 2011, Hotmail ranked as one of the most successful webmail service providers in the world with more than 360 million active users. And yeah, I had a Hotmail. I do not use Hotmail anymore, though. Like I said, I don't even know if it's still around, but it doesn't matter. He thought big. He had these big goals, and he got it done. And he eventually reached his dream. So going big. Succeeding big requires starting off thinking big. The only actions that become springboards to succeeding big are those informed by big thinking to begin with, says Gary. And he's got a graph here of trajectories of if you have a small goal, the trajectory is very low, versus if you have a big goal, the trajectory is higher. Again, going back to what the threshold example, 50 points versus 20 points. Right. How big you think becomes the launching pad. It sets the trajectory. And really, just by setting goals, you're creating an artificial ceiling for yourself. And Gary talks about this principle of boxes. How big is your box? And it's the same thing to what we were just talking about a moment ago with trajectories. You have a small trajectory, your outcome ends up being in this smaller box. But if you set a bigger goal, bigger trajectory, now you have a bigger box to work with. And it's not to say that, you set a goal of 20 points and you can exceed the goal. You definitely can, but just from experience, the mentality there is, hey, I reached my goal and I'm going to stop. And there's actually one of the 48 laws of power by Robert Greene is, hey, if you reach your goal, you stop once you reach your goal, is one of the 48 laws of power. Because I think the way Robert Greene explained it is you never want to overdo things. Because then you set yourself up to things that we've talked about in this book about being stressed out, getting burnt out. So you reach your goal and then you stop, rest, meditate, think on it, set the next goal. But you don't just keep burrowing and burrowing forward and exceed your goal, because eventually you're going to achieve everything. And then what do? I think that's what Robert was talking. I'd have to go back and look again, but maybe some of you guys out there are familiar with the 48 Laws of Power and Robert Greene's book. I think that's what he was talking about with that. So what I'm saying is, you set the goal of 20 points. Most people think, oh, I've reached my goal, I don't have to do any more. But hey, set that big goal and now you score 45 points. Now it makes you hungrier for the next time. Let's go to the next slide. The big deal. Carol Dweck. So I've actually read her book, Mindset. I believe it's called Mindset. They actually gave it to me when I started at my current company right now. The HR manager gave me that book. And she talks about this difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And this was a very cool book, and it directly correlates to Gary's idea of thinking big. Growth mindset, I would characterize as, hey, you think big. You think that everything, there's an opportunity. You're willing to learn things. You're willing to take some risks. Fixed mindset is like the complete opposite of that. Fixed mindset, you limit yourself. You see yourself failing. You don't believe in yourself. You just kind of stay in your own bubble. You have that small box. You set that goal of 20 points because you don't think it's ever possible you can score close to 50. So directly correlating to this big mindset, the difference between a growth and a fixed mindset. And that's not a bad book either. Carol Dweck, Mindset. She was a Stanford psychologist. Blowing up your life. You must be open to the possibility that your life and what you accomplish can become great. When you fear big, you work against it. What you really should fear is mediocrity. And who was that guy? There was somebody who had a quote saying that our biggest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our biggest fear is that we are like greater than we ever expected. And I think people really fear that. It's not that you should fear mediocrity, but people fear the responsibility and the consequences of becoming big, achieving their goals, because all of a sudden there's a lot of eyeballs on you. Right? Now you have more things to manage. You think it's going to become stressful, but these are just like the lies that you tell yourself. It's sure, you might take on more responsibilities as you become successful in your life, but that comes with the territory. And like Notorious B.I.G. said, more money, more problems. That just comes with the territory. Right? You're afraid of you getting to that point because it's unfamiliar. You don't know what's going to happen. But once you get past that and start to think big and start to realize, yes, things are going to change in my life, and that's okay. Yes, I'm going to have more responsibilities. Yes, there's going to be more eyeballs on me, maybe more attention as I become more successful. Yeah, I'm going to have to manage more things, but would you rather be that or mediocre? And some people choose mediocre, and hey, I don't fault them for that. There's some things in my life that I'm okay with being mediocre at, like golf. I don't really practice golf as much as I used to because I've got other things that I'm working on. So just as an example from my life, big takeaways, the big ideas from this chapter. You guessed it, think big. That's the first one. Don't order from the menu. This is interesting. Apple celebrated 1997 Think Different ad campaign featuring all these different artists. They ignored the menu and ordered their own creations. Excuse me. So don't order from the menu. Build your own omelet. You set the trend. And by setting the trend, you're acting bold. You're going out there and saying, hey, I'm going to do things kind of my way. And I don't fear the failure or the repercussions that come from that. Because it's those that push the envelope that tend to be successful. And when you push the envelope, chances are you're thinking big. I don't know how many times I've used big in this episode, but I think you guys get the picture. Think big. Think big. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. Guys, thank you very much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. We've got some exciting things coming up with some new books that I'll be reading and still trying to finish the one thing as well. Got some local authors in the works that I'm going to be reading some of their books and hear local Michigan authors and potentially talking to them. So stay tuned for that. Next time, we're getting into part 2 of the one thing, which is the truth. The truth, the simple path to productivity. So we're going to be switching gears on the one thing. We were just talking about the lies. Now we're talking about the truth. Guys, thank you so much for listening. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.